Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're continuing our journey through the MPEP, that's the Manual of Patent Examining Procedure, MPEP.
Yep, section by section, digging in.
And today, we're hitting Chapter 2100, which is all about patentability.
Right, a really core chapter.
Specifically, we're zoning in on Section 2112. It's titled, Requirements of Rejection Based on Inherency, Burden of Proof. Sounds pretty technical.
Oh, it is, but it's absolutely crucial. This section 2112, it's, fundamental if you want to understand what the Patent Office considers prior art, stuff that's already out there.
Prior art. Okay, so this section helps define that.
Exactly. It explains how something can be considered prior art even if it wasn't, explicitly written down or described in full detail before. It deals with the concept of inherency.
Inherency. All right, let's break that down. What does inherency actually mean in this patent context?
Okay, so inherency basically means it's a property or maybe a function that is necessarily present in something already known, what we call a prior art reference, just there, part of its nature.
Even if nobody realized it at the time.
Precisely. Even if it wasn't recognized or understood back then. If it was an unavoidable characteristic, it's inherent.
Huh. That's quite a concept.
Yeah.
It sounds like it could have some major implications. Do you have an example of how this works?
Sure. The MPEP itself brings up a case, Sharing Corps v. Geneva Farm.
Okay, sharing. What was the deal there?
Well, the main point from sharing is that if you can show later on, maybe through testing or analysis, that a particular property had to be present in something described in the prior art.
Even if the original document didn't mention it.
Right. Even if the proof comes way after the fact, that property can still be used as a basis to say, hey, this isn't new, and reject a patent claim. It was inherent.
Wow. Okay, so just because it wasn't written down doesn't mean it wasn't known in the eyes of patent law if it was fundamentally there.
You got it. It really shifts how you have to analyze prior art. You can't just look at the surface description.
So this leads to another point you mentioned earlier about finding new uses for old things.
Yes, exactly. Section 2112 makes it clear that just discovering a new use, or maybe a previously unknown property of something that already exists.
Well, that usually doesn't make the old thing patentable.
Okay, and there's a case for that too. Atlas powder.
Atlas Powder Co. v. Ioroco Inc., yeah. In that situation, there was a known chemical composition. Someone later discovered it had this useful property of sufficient aeration.
Sufficient aeration, okay.
But the court basically said, look, the composition itself was already known. Just finding out it has this property doesn't make the composition new. It was already out there, inherently capable of that aeration.
So finding a cool new trick for an old dog doesn't make it a new breed of dog, patent-wise.
That's a good way to put it. The underlying thing was already in the public domain.
Okay, this makes sense, but also raises a big question. If the Patent Office wants to reject a claim based on something being inherent, who has to prove it? Is it just assumed?
Good question. The burden of proof, Section 2112 is very specific here. If an examiner says something is inherent in the prior art,
they can't just wave their hands and say, oh, it was probably there. They need to provide a solid reason, a factual basis or some kind of technical reasoning.
So no mere speculation. They need evidence or logic.
Exactly. It can't just be a possibility. They have to show why it must have been present.
Okay, so the examiner has the initial burden. But does that burden ever, flip? Can it shift to the person applying for the patent?
Yes, it absolutely can. The MPEP covers this. The burden can shift if the claimed invention looks, well, substantially identical to what's in the prior art.
How identical are we talking?
Very similar. The case in Best is cited for this. If the structure or the process described in the prior art reference is basically the same as what's being claimed,
then the patent office can say.
They can establish a reasonable basis to assume that the claimed feature is inherently present in that prior art. And then the onus is on the applicant to prove that no, actually, there is a difference.
I see. So if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck based on the prior art description, you, the applicant, have to show it's actually, a goose.
Kind of, yeah. You need to provide evidence to distinguish your invention from what was inherently disclosed before.
Okay, this burden shifting is important. Let's talk through some more examples. You mentioned in Reschreiber earlier, the oil can spout doubling as a popcorn dispenser. That still sounds pretty wild.
It does, right. But it's a great illustration. The structure, the conical shape of that specific oil can spout described in the prior art meant it inherently could function as a popcorn dispenser.
Even though the original inventor never mentioned popcorn.
Not a word about popcorn. But the physical design itself made that function an unavoidable inherent capability. The structure dictated the function.
That really drives home how structure can dictate inherent function, even unexpected ones. Okay, what about the other case? PAR Pharmaceutical.
PR Pharmaceutical
Huh?
Inc., VTWI Pharmaceuticals Inc. This one is more of a cautionary note, particularly for obviousness rejections that rely on inherency.
Cautionary how?
It basically warns against stretching the idea of inherency too thin. You can't just say, oh, it would have been obvious to combine these things, and the result inherently has this property.
Right.
There needs to be clear evidence or strong logic backing up the claim that the property is truly inherent in that obvious combination. It reinforces that inherency isn't just a guess.
Got it. So again, it needs to be necessary, not just possible or likely. Solid proof or reasoning is required.
Precisely. Inherency needs a firm foundation.
This is really clarifying the edges of prior art. How does inherency interact with other patent concepts, like product by process claims?
Good connection. So product by process claims are where you define a product by the method used to make it.
Right.
Inherency can come into play if the process described inevitably, necessarily, results in a product that was already known, even if that known product wasn't previously described as being made by that specific process.
Ah, so if your new recipe inherently makes the same old cake, it's still the same old cake.
Essentially, yes. If the end product itself isn't novel because it was inherently produced or known before, the way you got there might not save it.
Okay. And what about the printed matter doctrine? That one seems a bit different.
It is a bit different, but inherency connects here too. The printed matter doctrine generally says that just adding new printed words or pictures onto an old product or using an old process with new instructions usually doesn't make it patentably new.
Why not?
Because the printed information is often considered non-functional. The underlying structure or process, the thing itself, is old. Its inherent nature hasn't changed just because you slapped new instructions on it.
So the physical thing is the same.
Right. The MPEP uses Inherency as an example here.
What happened in a guy?
There were two kits. Structurally, they were basically identical. The only real difference was the instruction sheet included in the kit.
And the court said?
The court said the different instructions, the printed matter, didn't make the second kit patentably distinct from the first, because the underlying physical kit, its inherent structure, was the same old thing.
Okay, that makes sense. The invention has to be in the thing itself, or the core process, not just the label on the box.
Exactly. It's about the substance, the inherent characteristics.
So let's try to wrap this up for you, our listener. What's the absolute key message from MPEP Section 212 on inherency?
I think the biggest takeaway is this. Patentability hinges on what is genuinely new and non-obvious compared to the prior art, considering everything that prior art inherently discloses.
Not just what was explicitly stated.
Right. It's not enough for an inventor to simply recognize or discover a property that was, digamos, hiding in an old invention all along. You have to show your invention possesses features or characteristics demonstrably absent from the prior art, including its inherent properties.
It underscores the need for really thorough prior art searching, doesn't it? Thinking about not just what's written, but what must have been true about those older things.
Absolutely critical. You need that objective analysis of what the prior art necessarily includes.
Okay, so summarizing the key points. Inherency covers properties necessarily present, even if unrecognized. Finding a new use for an old thing usually isn't patentable on its own. The examiner must provide a basis for inherency, but the burden can shift to the applicant if the invention looks very similar to the prior art.
And cases like Sharing, Atlas Powder, Schreiber, and Guy illustrate these points. Plus, inherency connects to product by process claims and the printed matter doctrine.
It all comes back to whether the core invention is truly different in its inherent nature.
That's the heart of it.
Okay, definitely gives us a lot to think about. And speaking of thinking, here's a final thought for you. As our technology gets better and better, think advanced analytics, AI, analyzing things at incredibly small scales. How do you think that will change how we apply this inherency doctrine?
That's a fascinating question.
Will we start discovering inherent properties in prior art much more easily, potentially making it even harder to claim something is truly new? What does that mean for future innovation? Something to ponder. Join us next time for another deep dive.
And a special thanks, as always, to Mike Shepard, the creative director who makes this series happen.
Just a reminder for everyone listening, this discussion is for educational and informational purposes. It's generated using AI tools and might have errors. It is definitely not legal advice. For real guidance, please consult the official MPEP test and a qualified patent practitioner.